Okay, and so welcome to our February meeting of Horse History virtual seminars. Today we'll be talking about traditions of horsemanship from all around the world, and going from the American West to Portugal and then to Latvia, kind of traveling more or less around the Western world. We have three papers by Brenda Wahler first, and Diane de Camproger will be second, and myself will be speaking third. And we will have questions at the end of the three papers. So if you have a question, you are welcome to type it in the chat, or at the end you will be able to unmute yourself and ask the question or give your comments while speaking, whichever way you prefer this, okay? And welcome everybody, and let's settle for the first paper by Brenda. Okay, so Brenda, you are welcome to start.
All right. Well, I'd like to first of all say welcome and thank you for having me speak today. I am talking to you from very cold and very snowy Montana, where it is still winter. This portion of the talk is about the equestrian traditions in basically North America, and specifically in the American West. And we're sort of going in reverse chronological order because the first thing that has to be understood about America's traditions is that we primarily came from Spain. The horse, as a lot of people on this group know, went extinct at roughly at the conclusion of the last ice age after the Bering Land Bridge closed. And so for somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 years, there were no horses in the Americas. And so the horse itself had migrated across Beringia into Asia, where a few thousand years later, humans domesticated the horse and it spread throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. And we also know that the Iberian Peninsula developed a particularly strong tradition of both horsemanship and exploration. And so what we had happen was in 1519, horses returned to the Americas, to the mainland of North America. There had been some horses brought earlier by Columbus into the islands in the West Indies. But as far as a permanent population being restored to the Western Hemisphere, to the Americas, this arrived with Cortez, and he brought 16 horses with him when he first landed in what today is Mexico. And at that point, the horse thrived. This is a George Catlin painting of wild horses spreading throughout the American West. The horse became quickly adapted to North America, and there's a working theory out there that they were not an invasive species or an introduced species, but a indigenous species that was reintroduced after a 10,000 year gap, which is a huge political issue in the West to this day. The role of the feral horse and its place is it's a very touchy subject in the West. So when the horse reached the American mainland, there were two primary purposes for which the horse was used. The first being military, and that we have an image here of a sort of an American style pikeman, horse mounted with some weaponry, with the image on the left. And then the other huge purpose was to manage livestock. And we have an image on the right showing cattle came over on ships, just like horses people came over on ships. And cattle also thrived, starting in what today is Mexico and spreading both north and south, as did the horse. The next thing that happened was that native people very quickly adopted the horse and the new technology that the horse represented. This is what they call a ledger drawing by an individual named Elkhead, who was a Hidatsa. And his caption on it says, "Elkhead steals a horse from the crows, branded S." And this represents one way that the horse spread. For the most part, when the horse came north, with both Spanish people and with native people, there was a certain amount of a learning curve. You can't just walk up to a horse and jump on it and ride. So there was a need for knowledge. And the Spanish were fairly brutal in their conquest, but one thing they could be relied upon was that they needed other people to shovel manure for them. And these people, the stable hands, the indigenous people that began to work for the Spanish, developed a knowledge of horses, and then either traded or stole or whatever to build their own herds. There were several major events that happened. Oñate tried to bring an expedition up into what today is the modern United States. And in doing so, he didn't plan particularly well, and he lost several hundred horses, mostly stolen. The Spanish colonized what is modern day New Mexico, and in 1580 there was the Taos Revolt, where people overthrew their conquerors, and in doing so confiscated about 1,500 horses. And so through both war, theft, strays, horses made their way slowly north. This map, and I have to add a power cord here for a moment, so I may duck out of the screen. This is a map that is from a book titled, it's by Martin and Cowdery, the Bridles of the American Indians, and some of the other artwork. The Art of the Equestrian Equipment. This is a fantastic book that reviews current research. And it shows that for the most part, the horse spread throughout America faster and more thoroughly than a lot of earlier research indicated. The most cautious scholars will say that, well, we only are going to say the horse arrived in an area when a white man got there and wrote something down and said, "Oh, I saw horses." But when you factor in how long it takes people to master the management of horses, the equestrian skill required to train horses, it was obvious that by the time white explorers made their way west and north, the horse had long preceded exploration. The horse spread ahead of any kind of European exploration. And if we take a look down in the pink area of what is modern day Mexico, you see some of the core areas where equestrian traditions developed. And then on the map where we see a change from green to brown is, some people will call, that's roughly the continental divide of the United States, a major mountain range. And so most horses spread, one group on the east side of the continental divide via Texas, Oklahoma, modern day Kansas, into Colorado, Wyoming, and that direction. But the quicker route was actually up the west side of the continental divide, where you see the yellow arrows. For one reason, that area had more water. There were more rivers, there was more, it was a little bit more of an established trade route already. And so horses made their way up west of the continental divide, also through what would be modern day Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and eventually into Utah, Montana. And then as you look at the orange arrows, you see the horse spreading into the Pacific Northwest. Now, the second tradition that became part of America's equestrian tradition comes through California. And on this slide, you can't see this quite as well, but if you look at these purple arrows, you'll see that horses actually got to California a little bit later in the game, mostly directly from trade. You had expedition to San Diego Bay, 1769, and then from there north. And again, what adjusted the spread of the horse was the mountain range. You have the coastal, the Sierra Nevadas and the coastal ranges were kind of a barrier to horse movement going farther east or west. So with these three strains of spread of the horse, you develop different traditions. And the first of those, if my slide will cooperate, was how Native people, first of all, they adapted existing technology to their own uses. The image of a saddle on the horse on the left is a modern horse in, I believe in Spain, I believe it's an Andalusian, with a traditional style saddle. The image on the right is a native saddle made by the Blackfeet people, dated to about 1850. And you can see the design is nearly identical. Native people adapted the equipment and the tools and the training techniques of the Spanish. However, they also defined this particular saddle as one that only the women and the old people rode these saddles, because if you were a young guy and you needed to hunt, you needed to move fast, you needed to cover great amounts of territory, you needed different technology. And so Native people also adapted various new techniques of riding. I've zoomed in on the elk head drawing, and you'll see that the first thing they adapted was the fact that they simply were not going to get a lot of manufactured equipment unless it was stolen. And so they adapted equipment for their horses out of their own natural environment. This would include the jaw loop bridle, and that the again, Cowdery and Martin maintain that the jaw loop bridle, where you just tie a rope around through the horse's mouth and under their jaw, was unique to North American Native culture. That it did not seem to be something that was just adapted from other cultures from Asia or somewhere else. It was something they came up with themselves. And then on the right, I have an elaborate, it's a decorated version. The practical ones were a little bit more plain, but of what they called a pad saddle. We all know that the stirrup and the saddle tree were invented for very good reasons, that both protected the horse and helped stabilize the rider. And this beaded saddle pad is an example of a native pad saddle that would have been used by hunters, young people. They would have been used in warfare. It would have been used to go out and hunt bison. But again, you see that they quickly adapted the stirrup, and they quickly, even though they needed a lighter piece of equipment, they adapted that as well. So, and I just want to make sure the technology is still working. Everybody with me so far? Okay. This is an example of how the horse culture spread north from Mexico. This is Charlie Russell, a painting of, it's titled Lewis and Clark Meet the Flathead Indians at Ross Hole. This is from Montana. This would have been, I love this painting. It was made in 1912, but he was depicting the Lewis and Clark expedition. And if you ever want to say, what was the Western tradition like, look at the paintings of Charles M. Russell, because Russell was very devoted to authenticity. He lived with the Cayena people of the Blackfeet Confederacy for a while. He was a working cowboy. He authentically depicted the horses. He authentically depicted their equipment. Frederick Remington is more famous, but Remington was not as accurate in some of his images. He was more fanciful. He did things like having Native men riding in women's saddles, little things like that. He made some mistakes that those of us who compare that rivalry of Russell and Remington, we point out that Russell's authenticity is greater. What is the most amusing thing about this image, though, is not simply that the horses are front and center, but also if you look over to the right-hand side of the image, and I'm trying to get it to position, Lewis and Clark are these small standing figures off on the right-hand side, and you will see a woman with a child sitting on the ground who was Sacagawea, who is their native guide. She was a Shoshone woman and helped them establish good relations with the tribes as Lewis and Clark traveled to the west. So when we get to 1800, we have a very solid tradition of horse culture amongst native people. We also have a very powerful vaquero tradition that came out of Mexico. This is a Remington painting. It shows the equipment by the 1800s. You can see the adaptations made for the western part of North America, which is very dry. Some elements that are core to this tradition include wide brimmed hats because it is hot. You need to protect your head from the sun. You see on the saddle, there is what we now call a saddle horn designed to dally a rope. You would take if you would rope a cow, you would take that rope and you would wrap it around the horn, and then you would use this leverage. You would not, there's two different uses of the saddle horn in modern use. There are people who will tie the rope to the horn hard and fast, but the vaquero used it as a leverage device. He'd take 2 or 3 dallies around the horn and then control by adding and removing tension from the rope. You see his riata, which is hanging from the saddle. That was braided rawhide. They could be extremely long. Some of them were, 50 feet long. They had a lot of rope, a lot of distance. The horse, you can see, has and I think this is a somewhat inaccurate image, one examples of Remington kind of messing things up. The horse is wearing a spade bit, and this noseband, however, should be a bosal. That the hackamore was a tool that was used very similarly to the double bridle, in that you started a young horse with a hackamore noseband, and then as the horse had better training, then they added a curb bit, but they continued to wear a lighter hackamore, and they actually called it a 2-rein, and we would think of it as actually 4 reins, but that the hackamore would act as a snaffle bit does in a double bridle, and then of course the curb bit does what a curb bit does. Another feature of this tradition is you'll notice the neck rope on the horse. They call that a get down rope. Nowadays, at least that's what the cowboys call it now. I cannot remember what the Spanish word for it is, but it's just basically if the rider had to dismount, you can't tie up a horse with the reins. So they would just take that rope and loop it around something to restrain the horse while they did whatever they needed to do on the ground. This tradition of vaqueros evolved into America. They anglicized the word from vaquero to buckaroo. And these are the Western traditions from west of the Continental Divide. They began to call it also the Californiano tradition. The cattle and livestock herding traditions that developed on the west side of the Continental Divide and that developed in California, then crossed the Sierras, made their way to the Pacific Northwest. And you can see how, and this was a painting, it's called C.M. Russell and His Friends. You can see how this was Russell himself. This was a self-portrait. And you look at how he spent a lot of time getting the equipment correct. And what you can see is horse with a spade bit. You see the little rein chains that are used to balance the rein. You see the rawhide, that white rein with a lot of knots in it. That is a rawhide closed rein. You go up to his hand and you see comes down off of it is a quirt that would have been used to herd cattle. It's called a romal. So romal reins. You look at the lariat or riata on his saddle. Cowboys called it a lariat because the Mexicans called it lariatas. So, of course, one word blended into the other, just like vaquero became buckaroo. Again, you see he's got a rawhide rope, very, very long. If you look at a modern team roper, modern rodeo performer, those ropes are much, much shorter, and they're not as flexible. They're very stiff. This was a very flexible, very long, very strong rawhide rope. You will see spurs. You will see, very firm saddle tree. The tree of the Western saddle was designed to spread out the rider's weight, so there was fewer pounds per square inch across the horse's back, because they would be sitting in that saddle all day long. And you didn't want a horse with a sore back. You did not want a rider who was in pain. You needed a secure seat when you're going into very rough territory. Russell also always acknowledged that there was more than one tradition. And although this particular image is kind of small and he didn't paint these people clearly, these other men that you see riding up toward him have distinctive hats, distinctive clothing. You can see the red scarf on one man, a vest on the other. And when you look at these more closely, you'll see the rider in front has a pair of very wide kind of bat wing style chaps to protect his legs. You will see that he's got a higher crowned hat with a flat brim. The other rider with the red scarf has their hat tipped back, curled up brim. All of this reflects the different cultures that people were able to access as they moved west. Russell's hat itself does not look like the Boss of the Plains. It's a very cut down brim. It's a little shorter hat. You don't see a hat that looks like that today at a modern rodeo. The Western tradition adapted to the land. That's a grizzly bear in the middle of the picture. The title of this painting is "Loops and Swift Horses Are Surer Than Lead." And this was began in California, that the people were trying to protect their cattle herds from predators. And the grizzly bear was the biggest predator of all. And so this was one way they would capture and restrain such an animal before they would remove it as a threat to their cattle herds. Again, you're looking at the tradition. You're looking at how did these people ride? What did they have to do? The horse looks in distress, but it's a very distressing situation. You look at the type of horse, you can see very strong thoroughbred influence in these 19th century horses. They were a blend of the wild horses first brought up by the Spanish and crossed on thoroughbreds brought from the East. By the time we get to the 19th century, this was a photograph of 1888. And this was a California horse, California cow horse, Kern County. And again, you see in a photograph the same equipment as we see in the Russell paintings. You see the knotted rawhide romal reins with the chains to balance the bit, a spade bit. This is a finished horse. You can tell he is a finished, polished horse because he rides only in a curb. There is no hackamore. You see the very, very long riata. You see the saddle horn. And the other adaptation, you see this is actually kind of a fancy tapadero, the stirrup cover, preventing a rider from getting brush coming through their stirrups and then stopping the horse or trapping the rider. The other tradition coming from the East Coast was, once the British arrived in the Americas, they brought their horses along too, and they were a little different from the Spanish. They brought their thoroughbreds. These horses were crossbred. They spread west along some of the traditional wagon trails. And so by the time you get to the 19th century, you have two traditions have kind of met and blended. You've got the tradition that came from Europe, that came by way of Northern Europe, by way of England, to the eastern coast of America, and then spread west. And this was epitomized by Western industrialists, and this man is Marcus Daly, building huge horse ranches. This is one in Montana. The photograph is his stallion barn that still stands today. They've made it into a private home. His favorite horse was named Tammany and was Horse of the Year. He shipped him to New York to race, and he was Horse of the Year, I think I'm 1893. I'll have to double check, 1892 or 1893. The Montana also produced a Kentucky Derby winner. This horse is named Spokane. His owner is Noah Armstrong. And this photograph is what they call the Doncaster Round Barn that Mr. Armstrong built to protect his horses from the winter cold. And it is in this barn that Spokane was foaled. And so the Western tradition very much represented a fusion of two cultures. Recreation was a huge part of Western culture. It was very important to people in the West that they not be hicks, that they not be just, the cowboy was not a high status profession. The cowboy was often a person of color, poorly paid, young men for the most part. And once the country settled, you can see how they were very quick to adapt Eastern fashion as quickly as possible, Eastern horses as quickly as possible. And this grandstand you see that is just packed with people was the Anaconda Driving Park in Montana. This was built by Marcus Daly he started it about 1888, and they kind of built onto it until it looks like you see in this image, which was probably taken around 1900. But you can see that people turned out by the thousands to view horse races. And so the horse was not just a utilitarian animal, but it was also a source of entertainment and pride. Native people continued to keep a horse tradition alive, even in spite of the oppression that characterized the reservation era. This image, if you look closely, you will see these people are wearing scarves. This is a women's race. These are all young girls, and they are riding bareback. As you can see, there are no saddles. You have Western style bridles. This was at an event called Crow Fair, which was the celebration that still exists today, the Absalika people. It's their celebration of culture. And at Crow Fair, if you look at those horses, you can see that, again, the Crow did work with the United States cavalry a great deal. These horses have very strong thoroughbred influence. And so as you look at them before they run, they're high quality, they're refined. Some of them are really quite beautiful. This tradition is still alive today. If my slide will turn, hold on a moment. This is a photograph I took a couple of years ago when I was working on my first book, North American Indian Days. They still have traditional flat races on a round track. They also have an event they call Indian Relay. But as you can see, you've got jockeys, you've got saddle covers, you've got helmets. You don't have racing silks. Everybody knows everybody up on the Blackfeet Reservation. So you know whose horse it is, you know who the jockey is. Everybody already knows. There's not a program. But as you can see, the campground is in the background, and the races are still a huge component of Native culture today. Our modern equipment for Western riders still reflects that Spanish influence. You can see the image on the left is a horse that is wearing a traditional style Bosal hackamore with a Fiador throat latch, Macate reins. The saddle in the middle, nowadays they call this a Wade saddle. It's used a lot for team roping, managing cattle. The bit you see is a spade bit. These are not common in the West. We actually tend to use milder curb bits because the spade is a very delicate tool. As you can tell, that bit is intended, the very, very large port is actually, the spoon is intended to rest on the tongue of the horse so that it can be responsive to just the lightest pressure of a rein. Just twitch your little finger, because you need to have a horse that is very light in the bridle when you're riding them with one hand and you're carrying a lasso in the other and trying to rope a cow. The spade bit also, if you look at the port in the center, there's a little roller where a high-strung horse can move their tongue and play with that roller back and forth to maintain a moist mouth. And then you see the braces coming up toward the spoon on either side, which are of copper, and again, to encourage salivation and lightness in the bridle. And as you can see, this image of the vaqueros, this is the adaptation of the equipment. This horse is wearing a bosal with Theodore. You can't really quite see the saddle horn or whatever that is on the rider's, on the horse, but you can see that they have chaps to protect their legs. They have tall boots, leather pants or leggings, wide brimmed hats, protection from the elements. There's not a lot that's changed here. And finally, the modern sport in the West, we're still working cattle. This is the sport of cutting, where a horse has to separate one cow from the herd and then keep them from returning. You can see that what is the ideal form for the rider, long rein, the horse is acting on its own. The rider usually has to just hang on to that saddle horn because the horse is moving so quickly to keep that cow out of the herd. And as you can see, the horse, probably himself, very dominant body language. That horse is trying to dominate and control the cow directly with very little assistance from the rider. And the other thing we see today is a sport called Western dressage, where we are attempting to fuse the Eastern and Northern European traditions that a lot of people are familiar with today with Western style horsemanship and riding. And this is just simply an example of a rider that is schooling their horse in that tradition. So with that, I will go ahead and conclude my portion and let the next speaker go ahead.
Very much. Thank you very much, Brenda. That was just brilliant. Oh, I've got a little co-speaker with me. He was just mesmerized by your horses, and so it's really interesting to see these parallels. And I'm really glad you mentioned some thoroughbreds as well. That's what we don't hear that often. I always love hearing about thoroughbreds because I own one. I'll tell her later this evening. She was in the talk. So now we are going to move on to our second speaker, Diane, and see what she says. And if you have questions, everybody's very much impressed. The questions can be discussed later on. So Diane, it's your turn to share and to speak. Everybody was enjoying this. So then, how are you doing? Can you share the screen? Is everything all right?
Yes, it is. Sorry, I had some little connection, but it's good. So I'm sharing now. I hope everyone can hear me well.
Yes.
Good.
Perfect. Okay.
Is it good? You are seeing the presentation?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to maybe, yeah, put it smaller. That's good. So thank you very much for the invitation for speaking today. Difficult to go on after this presentation from Brenda. That was so interesting. I'm really frustrated not to be able to ask her questions right away. I'm going to lead you a little further to Portugal, where I'm living actually right now, and where I've been investigating last couple of months in the Evora University. So Evora is situated in Alentejo, Alentejo is the region which is just on the east side of Lisbon. And so it was not my first subject of investigation, because I'm fiction searcher. I'm a fiction investigator. I'm studying mainly the representations of horses and of the horse figure in the contemporary fiction, in modern fiction, but also how the myths and the legends were able to influence them. So I'm developing I'm presenting my thesis, my PhD thesis in June. So that allowed me to start it, to seek and to search on other subjects. And I wanted to look into Portuguese legends and myths and horsemanship traditions for a long time. So thanks to this invitation from the University of Evora, I was able to look a little more into this subject. So if you're seeing the little presentation, the little summary, I wanted to show you to start this presentation. I'm going to go from a dialectic angle. That means I will start with myths and the representation of Iberic horses and how they were linked to the reality, to some existence and economic value of the horses already from the first time of the Iberic Peninsula. Then I will go a little further in times in the Middle Age, where a lot of legends and myths about the horse and the horse riding tradition start to appear. We'll question a little about the falling of the horse, because in Portuguese we have a really different signification about the fact of falling of a horse. It can be both a death or a miracle. And then I will do a little situation point about the horse riding nowadays in Portugal, and how it still is really inspired by all the legends and the myths that have traditions in Portugal. So going by the beginning, from the myth, Iberic horses, they were known as far as Ulysses' travels. It is as far to say, they were seen as sons of the winds. So it's a tradition we start to see from the first Greek and Roman poets, that the horses from the Iberic Peninsula were the sons of the wind zephyr and Iberic mares. So that is really funny, because the supposedly birth of these magical horses were believed to happen by the wind blowing in the nose of the mares. This legend is supposedly to happen near the Tagus River, so near Lisbon. And until the 17th century, a lot of historians from Portugal and from Europe were trying to localize, to situate exactly where the sacred mount was and where this fertilization was happening. The horses that were born from this magical union were supposedly very wild, very fast, and to die young. These themes, this important characteristic of these magical horses were obviously an heritage of some of the Greek myths of Pegasus, who was supposedly the son of a god and a gorgon, or also some of Middle East and near the Dead Sea River legends, like the Fergana River. So I put you a little map of the Fergana Valley. I don't know if you knew about about these legends, but the Fergana Valley was really famous until the second century, and even from Alexander the Great's time to be a valley where special horses were bred with some really special properties, because we're supposedly sons of dragons and unicorns, and to be very fast and very powerful. And so they provoke some wars between China and Kyrgyzstan and some of the nomads tribes there, because they wanted to have these horses, as it was a really great power at the time. Alexander the Great was supposedly was known to have captured some of the Fergana horses also during his conquest. So they were really famous horses. I was a little more surprised to know about the Iberian horses, because it was not, oh, sorry, I'm losing my diapositive. So it was not such a famous out of Portugal legend, but I was really happy to see how it started. But this legend was also based on some really historical importance of a horse in all the Iberic Peninsula, especially around the Tagus River and around what is now Lisbon. We have some tracks of this because we found some Roman ruins that are dated from the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, especially what is known as a racetrack, which is on the top corner on this image. So you have the original, the racetrack photograph, and the plan of how it was supposedly working. So you can have, so the racetrack shape was not as round as we know it today. It was a rectangular shape, okay, with the tribunes for the honor spectators, and then all the rest of the crowd will see and assist to the show from the borders. So these remains were found in the late 20th century. So a lot of remains in Portugal were found in the middle of the 20th century. And so there are still discoveries and foundings about it that makes it really exciting and interesting. And there were also found in the 60s mosaic of horses in a Roman villa, which is known now as the Mosaic of Horses. It's situated in a private domain, which is known as Tor de Palma, famous for wines and for agriculture production. But already at the Roman time, they should have been created horses, and not any horses, but race horses, because this mosaic was supposedly represented 5 winners of races during the Roman times. So we have the really detailed descriptions of each of the horses, okay, with the name and the portrait of them. And so this is some of the remains we can find, in Portugal, about the fact that the Portuguese side of the Iberic Peninsula was really known about its horses and the fact that the horses were really fast. So we have some actual historical proof that they were really famous. You have to know that it was also one of the most important economic venue of the Roman times, okay, along with wine and salt, but the horses were already exported, from the Portuguese side of the peninsula, from the Roman times. So this is from the basis of the tradition in Portugal. When it became more interesting, because I don't know if you know a little about Portugal's history, but Portugal, after the Roman time, so it was occupied by the Roman from the 1st to the 5th century. And then we have some troubled times with different tribes, Visigoths and Celtic people, and a lot of different occupation of the Iberic Peninsula. And then we have the Moors, so the Arabs that are coming in the Iberic Peninsula, and stay too much in the north of what is now Portugal, but they stay 5 centuries in the south part, the middle to south part of Portugal. And so during this time, they still do some activities with horses, but we don't have so many manuscripts or so many proofs of their activities. So the Moors stayed there from the 7th to the 12th century. And then we have what we call in Portugal, the Christian Reconquest. And the Christian Reconquest appears at a time where Portugal is created. Portugal was, until the 12th century, region, an autonomous region of Spain, we could say. And it was willing to take its independence. And so the first king of Portugal, King Alphonse Henrique, thought it will be a good time to chase the Moors from Portugal and try to get the Pope to recognize Portugal as a proper country. And so it started to make the conquest of Portugal and to chase the Moors south, to eradicate them from the cities they were possessing in Portugal. And so this happens at the same time as the Crusades and as the arrival of the Templars in Portugal. And so we have all this Christian reconquest that will last from 1128 to 1250, which is also a times of settling also for the various religious orders. For a really simple reason, it's the fact that when you were chasing concurrents, where you were chasing the enemy from some lands, you didn't want these lands to be chased back by the enemy. And so the best way not to have these lands occupied again was to let to settle there some population. And the monks were a really nice population to have at the time, because they were educating the people, they were also taking care of the lands and making some really amazing progress in agriculture. So and it was also helping the quest of becoming a country recognized by the Pope. So as far as they were chasing, at the same time as they were chasing the more south, they were also letting the different religious orders settling down in Portugal. And that that movement allowed to expand the Christian religion in Portugal. And one of really a nice way to expand, to give a good idea to valorize the monks and the Christian heroes was to make them appear on horses. So I'm going to show you how, but that's the time I call the time for heroes, the time where you have a lot of riders that are starting to be known as heroes. For example, in Evora, the town I studied, we have a coat of arms which is still existing of Giraldo Saint Pavor, fearless Giraldo, which is represented always on a horse, which is also a really Iberic horse, if you can see, with the face he has and the round of the neck. And so Giraldo is always represented with two heads, which are the heads of the Moors he chased from Evora. So it's not really nice stories, because Giraldo was supposedly he came unannounced in Evora, and by some trick, he made the governor's daughter fell in love with him, And like this, he could enter the city and then he cut the head off to the daughter and to the governor. So he's known to be this beheading hero, and he's always represented with the two heads of the people he killed, which is actually not really heroic or not really noble if you think of it. But at the same time, we had the popularization of Arthurian novels, for values of chivalry that were coming in Portugal also, and so all of the characteristic of horse riders were enhanced. They were supposedly constructing the idea of a horse hero, the hero that is coming on his horse and liberating the town. They were also doing this with some of the saints. For example, two of the saints that were really popularized at this time and that we still find a lot in different statues and representations and portraits is Saint James, so the one you see on the left side. So Saint James is now known as a pilgrim, really humble pilgrim on his foot, but it was not on the only representation of Saint James, because Saint James was first known as Santiago Matamoros, which means literally Santiago Moor Killer, which is a little less sympathetic. And so Saint James, it's in its more killer version, is represented on a horse also, with some Moors and rebels on his feet, which is attacking. And you can see the representation of the horse, which is really similar to Pegasus. We have all this white and the impression that the horse is flying above the Moors. You also have some numerous representation of San Martino, which is always represented also on a horse, and that has given that has inspired a lot of feasts linked to the horses in Portugal even nowadays, and is represented a lot, and he has a great list of enthusiasts here in Portugal. And always, I think this is a little my theory, but because of the representation of St. Martin's always on a horse, that helped making him the figure of a hero. But it was also used, the horses were also used to send messages. And so we have two real heroes, historic heroes, for example, that are represented with horses in Portugal a little later on the date, because I'm talking already 14th century and 18th century. The first one is a monk that was a war hero, but that finished his life as a monk in a monastery. He was the richer man of Portugal, but he was also living a really humble life. He was known as Cavaleiro Nuno Alves Pereira, so the knight Nuno Alves Pereira, and he helped during a dynastic crisis in Portugal. He helped the king to gain his throne in the late 14th century, and so he's one of the most known historical rider heroes of Portugal. He also had some songs and some poems written about him. I had put one, but maybe I can after give it to you in the chat. It's a modern song which is very nice, of Fado, which is also entitled the Monk Rider, and which is a reference to this hero. And then we have the statue. Maybe some of you know, if you have been to Lisbon, because it's still there. It has been inaugurated at the at the end of the 18th century, which is a statue of the King Don José on a horse, a Lusitano horse. And it was put on Lisbon bigger square, not without a reason, because it was set there just 20 years after the big earthquake that destroyed all Lisbon and a big part of south of Portugal. And so the construction of this statue, and I found some historical notes and manuscripts that are enhancing this theory. And so this statue was really settled there as a message for the other neighbors, the other countries around Portugal, to show them that Portugal was on his feet again, that Portugal was another country that was mattering again, and even if it lost a part of its architecture, it didn't lost its weight. It was also the first statue made on a wall piece, because at this time the statue were made by parts and then fixed together. And this one is the first one of this side that was made that big on a wall. It's inspired by some of the equestrian statues of French King Louis XIV. But the big difference it has is that, I don't know if you see well on this picture, but there is some snakes under the horses. And these snakes are here, are here to show that the horse and the rider, the King of Portugal, don't really care about the enemies. They can just, step on them. So this was a political, really strong message they were sending using the horse. And so to go further, I will talk a little about the legends also that are still existing in Portugal, about the horses and the horse riding. And so we have a really paradoxical vision of the horse still in Portugal, because the horse is first death bearer in the sense, in the meaning that it's the one that is bringing the accidents, the death, the enemy. And so we have a lot of stories and legends that are relating falling from a horse and funest or fatal consequences by falling from the horses. This is something we find a lot, especially in the churches, and as a moral, with a moral ending. But the horse is also considered as a sign of God. And so we have some legends, especially near the sea. We have the problem, the difficulty in Portugal is that a lot of the traditions are oral and they are not written. So it's really difficult to find some manuscript or some relating facts about it. But one of the most famous legends about a horse and a rider is the legend from Nazaré, from the people who may have visited this village, which is more known from the waves, because it has really big waves. But Nazaré is also known as the place where noblemen were hunting a deer, and while hunting a deer, you can see him here, while hunting a deer, his horse, he was in the clouds, and so he was not seeing so much about the whereabouts. And so he doesn't see that he's coming really close to the cliff. And so the horse at the last minute realized that he's jumping into the cliff and jumping into and falling down. And so the horse fall down and the rider fall from the horse, but instead of falling in the sea and killing himself, he miraculously managed to hide himself in part of a rock, and so he achieved to save himself, and he sees this miracle as a sign of God, and so he decides to settle on this same cliff a little sanctuary. And so this is the azulejos, the tiles frame that you can find on the sanctuary, because that was held there from the 18th century, supposedly, by this seigneur, Fuas Rupinho, who was a lucky horse rider. And so a lot of legends or miracles are happening really similarly to this one, especially on all the coasts of Portugal. It's just a little difficult, especially with the new generations, to to have a totally right idea of legends, because it's starting to lose itself, and that's a drama that's really sad. But I hope some more investigations will be held in the future. To come about some more recent tradition in Portugal, I wanted to do this last part about a little more about the horse riding in itself. So we have different type of traditions nowadays in Portugal that we can find, but they are still really looking into the past. There are a good combination a lot of times between the past heritage and the modern adaptation. For example, you have a great history of what we call art equestre, okay, the equestrian art. You have to know that one of the first books in Europe dedicated to equestrian art was actually wrote by a Portuguese king, Dom Duarte, in 1438. And but it just really late that they start actually organizing the studs only after gaining back their independence from Spain. They had been a little confused times in the 17th century, where they lost the independence from Spain and then they gained it again. And as a consequence, the king John I decided to organize the studs to be able to defend themselves better against the Spanish neighbors. And so they start really late to organize the studs, especially because in Portuguese, even if it's a small country, Portugal, a lot of studs were really far from one another. It was already at the time not so much populated, so much crowded, and so you had a lot of distance between the different studs. But at the 20th century, it was more famous because of the horsemanship master Nuno Oliveira, which has been teaching all around the world and who was famous all around the world. Only after its death, they started to have some actions about looking back into all the heritage, the horse heritage of Portugal, and they started to do this with different actions. We had the creation, I forgot to put it in this list, but we had the creation of carriages museum, which is really important, which was made just after the beginning of a republic, so in 1910, at the beginning of the 20th century. We have the first library dedicated to horses and equestrian art in the Palace of Queluz. It's one of the first physical library in Europe that opened in 2015. And then we had the process of enlisting the Portuguese horsemanship to UNESCO list of national heritage. So we have various actions that are made to promote and to enlist the traditions of horsemanship in Portugal in times. The picture you have here is from a really nice book about the traje português, which means the traditional suits and the traditional material of Portugal. So you have a Portuguese saddle here. So it's a little different from a Spanish one that Brenda showed us, because it's not lamb skin, but it's textile. It's like cloth. You have sometimes it can be in velvet, but it's a regular cloth. It depends of the models. And then you have some levers, and then you have little protection on the back side of the saddle. It has the specificity of having two really large parts on each side of the saddle, to especially because one of the type of horse riding that was really popular in Portugal and in Spain was the genet equitation, the genet horse riding, which was mainly practiced with a relationship with cattle and bullfighting. And then you have the proper outfit. So the traditional outfit for the man is coming with his hat, a little bolero or little coat, and then you have traditional pants with some buttons on the side. And then you have the double the bridle, which is with it used to be with two bits. Now it's traditionally so it started to be just one bit, but we still use 4 reins. And then the way of we say literally giving a gala air to the horse, which is the art of trancing the horse hairs and making his neck look bigger, especially because lots of horses in Portugal are not castrated. They are almost all stallions. It's still really masculine, the art of horse riding in Portugal. And so they still consider the horse as vitality symbol, as a masculinity symbol, and so they like to have stallions, horses. But we also have a lot of other popular events, which are also, like a lot of other things in Portugal, really paradoxal, because horse riding still seems like a really ritualized art in Portugal. Even when we're not doing equestrian arts, but even when we are doing popular events. For example, I gave you 2 different type of horse riding events you can find in Portugal. One is, I like to call it celebrating life, because it's popular fests. So we have different type of fests, like pilgrimages, which are still really linked to the religious and the legends. Because we always have some ritual and some how do you say it? Some, sorry, I'm losing my words sometimes in English. Some rituals at the beginning or at the end of a pilgrimage. So you have some sacred rituals, sometimes with a priest that is coming and blessing the horses and the riders at the beginning of the festival, at the beginning of a fest. So you have different popular fests. This one is a little less known, because usually the one everyone knows is the one of Saint Martin, which is happening in Golga, so a little town north of Lisbon, during 2 weeks, the 2 first weeks of November. But we also have other regional festivities. So this one, the Fest of the Colette in Carnado. And so they have all the traditional outfit, which is the Guardian outfit. The Campino, which was this character who was guarding the cattle in the countryside of Portugal. And so they were traditionally wearing this really red outfit, seen from a far point of view. And also they have this big peak to control the cattle and to direct him. And we have on the right side the more cattle-like events with the bullfighting, which is still happening in Portugal, even if officially the cattle is not killed. There is not a killing show. We're not killing the cows inside of the arenas, but from the 18th, 19th century, it still was a very popular show. And if you see the outfits the riders were having, it's a really traditional outfit from the 15th, 16th century that they are using, also with a tricorn of the hats and the horses, and even the different actors, because there's a lot of different actors and roles. It's like a big theater scene with everyone playing its own role and its own parts, and it's really ritualized with some musics, and everything is here for a reason and with a signification. And so they are, it's like traveling back in time, because they are still wearing outfits that were traditional in Portugal since the 16th century. So this was a representation from the early 20th, but we still have this. And so I will finish, I'm not sure about the time, I hope it's good. I will finish by thanking you for your attention. This was a little more recent and more modern event. This is actually a pilgrimage, even if we don't see it, which is going from Lisbon to my town, to Evora, every year. During 5 days, we're following a little statue of a saint, which is the saint of good travels. We are actually reconstituting all pilgrimage that was made during centuries from the people who were having cattle, and to bring them to the sanctuary to have a blessing, to have a good year and prosperous year. And so they are still reproducing this pilgrimage every year with 400, 500 riders coming from all Portugal. So it's a really, but it became less and less religious and more festive. So thank you very much for your attention. I think I will let Anastasia take back the microphone.
And I like the last image. I wish there could have been horseback pilgrimages in Latvia, because there are only feet pilgrimages. If there were horseback, I would go to every one of them.
I can invite you for the next one if you want. We can arrange.
Yeah, if I can do this, if I can afford it. But it looks spectacular. I was wondering if the horse, one of the horses had a tail clip. No, it's one of those gray horses. So we can discuss it later, I guess. I'll share my screen because, yeah, well, I need to do this and then we can talk about things. And I'm sure people are already have a lot to discuss, so I'll try to be kind of brief. And there is no one to stop me except for the kids. So let's see if it's doing, yeah, it's doing its thing. So from the plow to the Olympic arena, Latvian warm bloods, a little bit kind of history overview. There is still no history of the Latvian warm blood as a breed written. I'm sure I'm not the best person to do this. I'm still hoping some Latvian colleagues who are breeders will be doing this. There is actually the Association for Breeding Latvian Warm Blood. They have a little bit like a book, but it doesn't speak much about history. It's more about the criteria for evaluating them. It's also in Latvian. So people who have been listening to my other talks might have already heard part of what I'm saying, because I have been saying parts of this, but in kind of different arrangement. When I was thinking about this presentation, I was also thinking about the film National Velvet with Liz Taylor and those words by the jockey whom they want to hire. Only in England, a girl can lead a plow horse to the racetrack. I think only in Latvia, a disabled person can ride the horse to the Olympic silver, as Richard Snikus did with the King of Dance in Tokyo this last summer, and twice he had silver for his individual competition and silver for the freestyle competition. So brilliant. We have the King of Dance here. Brilliant Latvian warm blood, so beautiful, with a very strong personality and a lovely horse. I've been in the stable where he was stable, and I've been helping there. When he decided to open the gates and run away, that's my legend of the day, how we were chasing this $1 million horse all around the property. The horse who never jumps, who jumped the fence and the ditch while trying to escape us. And I was just imagining how he would break his leg while he was preparing for the Rio Olympic Games, and how I would be to blame. He never did the same. I was very glad when he left the stable and went back to his home stable. So a lovely horse, but probably not for a place which I'm managing ever. And very different from the Latvian warm blood as it was only some 60 years ago, which something I'm going to talk about. So the impetus for this talk was found quite randomly while I was looking for some other stuff. And it's a very unexciting book, one of 39 volumes covering materials of geography and statistics of Russia collected by the officers of the General Headquarters, 39 volumes of it, in the second half of the 19th century. Well, 2 volumes are speaking of the province of Livland and of the province of Kurland, both of which constitute modern day Latvia. Livland is extending, it's kind of part of Latvia and part of Estonia, but not whole Latvia, and Kurland is another region of Latvia. By 1860s, fun fact, there was 1 horse per 7 people in Livland, which I think is a lot, surely more than today. So you can number of cattle per 100 people, that's roughly, this part is roughly Latvia. That's the capital near to where I am now. And this part is Estonia. So it's kind of overlapping. And just to show you it in context, part of the Russian Empire, like a small part of the Russian Empire at the time. And what the author who is talking about horses in the province of Livland is writing, describing these horses, which at his time, as he writes, has lost many of its former qualities due to bad upkeep. And it's in its initial type, it's preserved only in the northern part of in Estonia. And the Estonians, according to him, are loving horses and using oxen for heavier work. I'm not sure if it's a sign of their love for horses that they're using oxen. Maybe it's a sign that they're quite poor and that the soil is quite stony and they cannot really use horses. And also, the author is talking that there are bad feeds, and that's why the horses are not so well kept. But fortunately, they're establishing some veterinary schools for kind of country farriers, so that they could be shoeing their horses in a rational way. So everything is about rationality. You know, this Victorian development of rationality, the rational mind, same as in the Russian Empire. One statement that he makes, and I highlighted in green, which is very interesting. He's suggesting that the breed of horses that he sees in Livland most probably originates from a mixture of the local breed from the Spanish breed of knights horses. Wow, how interesting. Do these horses look like Spanish? I want to look at this in more detail. But first of all, looking at the horses of Kurland, also very enduring horses with good stamina, and despite the fact they're also not very well fed, there's doesn't kind of affect them such a way. But unfortunately, they're using foals from at the age of 3 already to work the works which are used for adult horses. And the other thing he's talking about how much food each horse is using, and so on and so forth, how much hay, how much oats, which is also kind of interesting information if you want to connect it to the way we use feeds for horses today, and so on. But now back to this statement about the Spanish influence and horse and the fact that the knights were taking those Spanish horses. I mean, looking at this map of Europe in 1190, whatever value it has, we have Latvia here, the present day Latvia, Livonia here. And you know that Spain is there and Germany is in the middle. So we had German knights coming to Livonia, bringing horses from Spain. I mean, logistically, it's unlikely and irrational. Well, it's possible, but now let's look at some sources. Does my kind of logical thinking betray me? Maybe. I still don't know. So looking at the history of horse breeding in Livonia, Latvia, some kind of facts. So 1043 is the first written evidence by Adam of Bremen, who writes that the horses in Curone and Semigale are very good. Nice to hear. That's before the Latvia was, Livonia was kind of made into its homeland by the German orders. And apparently before they brought the wonderful Spanish horses there. But by the 14th century, the start of the Livonian order apparently had 40 broodmares. So who are these broodmares? We don't know. Are these broodmares brought from Spain? Are they brought from Germany? Are they local mares? We don't know. But they are breeding horses there. Apparently, because it's very hard to import horses into Livonia. You saw that geographically, there is the Kingdom of Poland, and they're not really good friends. You got Lithuanians also may not be such good friends with Germany. Well, you can bring horses by sea, which is not the easiest way to bring horses even today. But there we are. So we don't know where these broodmares came from, but the chronicles of the time, they're mentioning the fact that the knights of the Livonian order, they place very high value on their horse. At one point, they're even refusing to fight. They say to Grandmaster, "We are going to lose our horses." And the Grandmaster, very annoyed, says, "Oh, you're going to lose your lives, idiots." And of course, they do lose their lives. It just shows you how very much attached they were to their horses. They were scared that if they lose their horses, they're not going to have new ones. Why? Probably because the locals weren't sharing it, because bringing from Spain doesn't really work. And bringing from Germany doesn't work either that well. And then when going further in history, and what we know from the 16th century, we have a German historian Pras, because, well, at this point, history of Livonia was written by the German historians from Livonia. And the best horses of the time in the 16th century were coming from Low Germany, Phrygia, Westphalia, Braunschweig, Hessen, and also Livlander, Livonian horses. Well, he's writing 3 centuries after the date. Can we believe? Maybe. Anyway, so I said, oh, we found it, Livlander, Livonian horse. Unfortunately, the first unified Latvia-wide stud books are dated from 1924, 1940. So not even mid-19th century. And before that, we have really mixed history, different influences that went into horse breeding. Some of them recorded in stud books, which are managed by local owners. Of course, we don't know how peasants are breeding their horses. Actually, we have some pictures from the early 20th century with some of them before stud books. So this is the Latvian working horse from 1930s. Don't know anything about this horse. It looks like nice horse with nice temperament. And we have the Latvian warmblood of the heavy type after it's been improved. After the first stud books and after Latvia became part of the Soviet Union and the first purposeful breeding with imported stallions was well underway. A very big neck, kind of nice longish disposition, very nice stallion, something we would still see the Latvian of the heavy type. Now looking on some more nice horses. So these are all working horses. Horses at grass, horses which are in harness. That's a very nice picture because it shows us the relationship between the Latvian warmbloods and children. The Latvian warmblood was a heavy type. Of course, it's a peasant's horse. They have very stable disposition. They are very child-friendly. And in Latvian culture, I have met lots of Latvians who have never been riding before, like first time in the riding school, okay? And they come and say, oh, I know how to ride. I've been riding at my granddad's in the countryside. They put me on the back of the horse when I was 4. Okay, I fell off almost immediately, but I know how to ride. And some of these people have been trying to ride my thoroughbred mare, who wasn't impressed by their countryside riding skills. When she was ridden, she wasn't impressed by people who thought they knew how to ride, unless they knew it. But I mean, Latvian warmblood probably were okay with this. So some more nice pictures. And this one is the haymaking festival. You see the horse is decorated. Everything is decorated with leaves. And you see the whole family. And the horse is a member of this family, an honored member. And another picture of the same horse, of the Latvian horse ridden, not the same one. And this is remarkable because on the back of this photograph, we see the name of the rider, Rudolf Sliding. He's Latvian. And the horse is named Sasha. Sasha is a Latvian human name, short for Alexander. I think it's very endearing, but also kind of weird. Why then Latvians are naming their horse with a Russian name? Is it something good or something bad or whatever? But you approximately see the sizes of this horse. And more agricultural work, I wanted to show some heavier horses. From the 1920s, and then plowing horse, don't really see them, but that's a plowing competition, by the way. That's why you have lots of horses plowing the land. They had plowing competitions at the time, some sources. So if you go back really quickly to this first slide with the King of Dance, that's a different horse. So how do we get from the plow to the arena? And Richard Snick was not the only Latvian. This year we had the first Latvian equestrian entering the Olympic Games, Kristaps Neretnieks on Valor, who qualified to the semifinals, which means that he performed without mistakes all the jumps, and failed in the semifinals. Obviously, Ben Mayer and Explosion W took the first place, but it was kind of nice debut for the Latvian equestrianism. Before that, we had one rider from Latvia, Sergei Shakurov, who was riding for the Soviet Union in 1988 and didn't perform very well. But in his memoirs, he was writing that his horse was lame because of incorrect shoeing and was on drugs. Which is sad. But back to my question, why do we have such different horses? And the answer is we have 2 types: the heavy type. Here we go. That's the heavy type. And this is also the heavy type. That's the old type, so sometimes called the old type. And the new or the light type is the one which you would see in competition. And increasingly, unfortunately, that's the horse you would see in Latvia. I own 2 Latvian warmbloods. They are both of light type. If you look at their passports, one of them is pure Trachinian Hanoverian color. And she's got 1 Latvian or 2 Latvians somewhere in the 4th generation. The other is my own horse bred for me from scratch, Esmeralda. And she's a mixture of German breeds, a little bit of thoroughbred. And she shows like half Latvian, but I know her Dems line quite well. And this Latvian which shows there, it's actually almost pure Trachinian. So the Latvian warmblood of the light type is not really Latvian. It's mostly German imported with some Belgian and thoroughbred blood. And that's thanks to the breeding programs from the 1930s onwards, where they used lots of imported stallions, Trachinian, Hanoverian, Holsteiner stallions, and now increasingly also Belgian. Oh, there were also thoroughbreds and Arabians. Are these horses really Latvian? All breeds evolve. We all know things don't stay stable. The only problem I find with these horses is that they have very fiery personality, and people who want a horse for their hobby, for their family, for their kids, they want to buy a horse who has a fiery personality like King. And of course, King is very nice under his disabled rider because he's being ridden also by professional riders, apart from Richard, who is a very talented rider, but also severely disabled. You see it from the picture. He rides in grade 1, which is walk only in Olympic Games. The problem is if you take a Latvian warm blood of the light type, and they're tending them to breed them now with very aggressive, very sharp stallions who will jump very well, but who will not be good family horses. You sometimes have a disaster. So one of my Latvian warm bloods, the older one, is a rescue horse who was sold exactly because she was not the right match to her owner. And then unfortunately, the owner didn't know at the time, but fell into bad hands and was repurchased back after she went blind. For some reason, no one knows. But apart from going blind, which might have been an accident, she also went very skinny, which was probably not an accident. So my argument is that we need to return the heavy type. We need to breed the horses who will be good family horses, who will be good all-rounders, who are very enduring, for whom you don't need much feed, rather than those light types, which are very fiery, very spectacular, but unfortunately, a sports horse is not a sports car. You don't become a better, flashier rider by riding a sports horse. You need to become a good rider first and ride sports horses next. Unfortunately, didn't have much to say in my PowerPoint about the culture of the horse in Latvia. If you want to hear, we've got my husband here who's been investigating horse superstitions. He can tell more about the culture of the horse if people want to hear. That is.
If there are any questions afterwards, they will be.
And now let's start the discussion. We've got approximately half an hour, or as long as we want to, and we can start.
Okay.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, Kate was asking, is there a DNA on Latvian warm bloods? DNA research. No DNA research, unfortunately, on the Latvian warm bloods, and there's possible Spanish connections. And I see Cynthia's comment, breeds becoming hot and brainless, selected for looks. Unfortunately, in Latvia, they're not selected for looks, they're selected for being stupid and jumping like crazy, which are not the same thing, but anyway. So let's see. And Jane was commenting, cold snowy afternoon living at the foot of a mountain in the north of Ireland. Oh dear, we also are quite cold. Dom Duarte's treatises, so.
If people want to put questions into the chat, that might be a good way for us to answer them. And I also see that Diane has her hand up. So,
I have a question for you, Brenda.
Oh.
If I can.
Sure.
Anastasia, can I? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. No, thank you so much for a presentation. It was really hard to go on with just after you. And Montana is also a land I love because I used to go there almost every year for the last 10 years for touristic reason, because I'm also a horse teacher and I used to bring there tourists but this is other life and other subject. Now my question was more about your files. How did you manage to find, because I know a lot of the documentations was not that easy to find. So my questions for you was more, how did you manage to find all of your sources, or did you have some most main sources where you go to, and how could you cruise these sources? Because I think you had some cross sources too, and also some maybe more I don't know. So I was just wondering how you went to find your sources, and how did you made your investigation work that I found fascinating. Thank you.
Well, my first book, I've just put up a slide. This was published in 2019, and it's available, Amazon and all of the usual outlets. I found I had multiple sources. For people all over the world, the first place that you can look for American materials is the Library of Congress. And the Library of Congress, prints and photographs divisions, they have digitized documents. It's a very rich source of material. The second thing I simply have done is located digitized newspapers. And so again, that doesn't help people from the 14th century or the 16th century, but particularly from about the mid 1700s on, when they started the newspaper world really became a thing. They are trying very hard to digitize these old papers and get them online. And that's true not only in the United States, but I'm personally aware of a huge archive in Hungary. Hungary has got a great amount of material that they're trying to digitize, at least some papers, and get those online. And how much newspaper digitizing is happening worldwide really varies, but certainly in the United States, that's a big piece of this. The second or third thing I would say, besides newspapers and national archives, is that there are a lot of state and local historical societies where you will find just strange things like oral histories that they write down and then gather together in a great big volume, sort of here is the history of our town. And you will flip through those, and all of a sudden you'll come across, oh, here was Joe Schmo who brought 20 thoroughbreds to town and crossed them on his Morgan horses. And then you start looking in the newspapers for that name, and you suddenly see, Joe Schmo has his trotting horses at the horse races and he's winning. And then you go into a photograph archive and you look up that name, and all of a sudden here is Joe Schmo with his fine stallion, and then over here is his mare that was the, pulling the plow, and he crossed the two horses, and all of a sudden you had some fantastic type of animal. So a social history is a very useful thing for looking at horses. I think so much of what happens with horses does not happen within the official world of government records, at least not in the United States. I think where you have countries with state-sponsored studs, obviously those records are invaluable. But sometimes you have to just get to the museum and open the dusty books and turn the pages and just kind of know what you're looking for. And you're going to see a word, you're going to see the word horse, you're going to see the word thoroughbred, which is misused to refer to purebred animals. So that's just some examples.
Thank you very much. We have two questions in the chat. One about discussing monastic order during the Crusader periods and about where they rode. And the other question for Diane, the Fergana Valley myth. So maybe you could answer one about the Fergana Valley myth. Any literary sources you know of in the Middle Ages, early modern period?
Yes, I see this. So the first one was about the monastic orders. So we have a lot of different monastic orders. The one everyone is knowing more is the Templars, but we had a lot of other type of orders, and most of the monks were also going on horses and helping on the creation of horses and using them in their everyday life, etc. But the horses we had at the time, you have to imagine that they were really not that big horses in terms of tall. They were really smaller horses. We also, because the Iberic horse, you know, now is a creation. It's a really recent creation, actually. The Iberic horses we had in history, we have two autochthonous breeds here in Portugal, which were the Garano horse. And the Garano horse, it's like a brown pony, which is still living almost savagely. So we call it the feral horses in the north of Portugal, the east side of Porto. And so you have some Garano horses that were really nice because they were really good for the mountains and the hills we have in Portugal, because this is a little a joke we tell, is that Spanish, when they made the border, they just let the rocks and the hills for Portuguese people, and they kept to themselves a big plain valley to have agriculture. And it's half true, but you have over the Portuguese side, which is not really high, but really hilly, with a lot of different landscapes and a lot of rocks, granitic rocks, especially. And so we needed safe foot to be able to go along these routes and these paths. And so the horses were to adapt to this ground. So you have small size horses, really brown, the Garanos. And we have another type of horses, which was the Soraya horse, S-O-R-R-I. AIA. And so the Soraya horses, they are more originated from the Tagus River, so more south of Portugal. They were usually gray, with sometimes this donkey line on the coast. They're also not really big. They're more like, I don't know if you're counting in letters like in France, but like C or D pony, like it's, you know, 1.40 m, 1.50 m. Garano are a little smaller. They're more like 110, 120 meters high. The Soraya is a little bigger, but it's also really heavy. Not heavy, but they can have more weight and are really endurance. And then during the Arabic period and a lot of importation, you have to imagine that Lisbon was kind of a middle-aged place to be. You had, for example, at the 10th century, you had already 100, you know, you have 100, not that much, but 100,000 people more or less in Lisbon. When in London or in Paris, there were only like 10,000, you know, it was a really, really big place, Lisbon. And you have a lot of ships and a lot of trades, because we had all the Mediterranean Sea that was making all the rounds of Spain and Iberic Peninsula and the peak to go to Lisbon. And then you had some trades with the north of Europe, and then you had some trades with the north of African Peninsula. And so a lot of these exchanges made a big influence on the breeding. So this is a little about the breeding. And then the equipment. So the details of the armored riders, we do have a lot of information about the family and the aristocratic families, especially all the aristocratic historical chivalry in Portugal. It was really well documented. If you happen to go to the Sintra Palace, for example, you also have this big coat of arms room where you have all the 70 families of Portugal, the historical 70 families of Portugal. So it's in Sintra Palace. And these 70 families, they have archives and family historical manuscripts that we can easily have access to. And so they usually informs of how they were equipped. And you have to imagine some really heavy equipment for all the parade. What is more difficult to find actually is the everyday equipment. I mean, even for the carriages, for example, you have a great collection of carriages, but they are feast carriages, the one that you can see in Belém, okay, which is just outside Lisbon. You have this big museum of carriages, but the only one they kept in history are the celebration carriages, the one reserved for the reception of a minister. And so you have all the heavy equipment, the one which is really show off, you know, the really obvious one, really stylish with all the garments and everything. The everyday transportation, the everyday equipment, it's really harder for us to find, because most of the people don't like to be reminded of their less noble pieces in history. And so that's a little problem we have for equipment and for carriages, is that some I know of, for example, are taking rust and dust, and we are closed in some places where no one wants to go there and study it in detail. And so we're a little afraid this heritage can be lost in time. So we're trying to preserve this, but it's a little harder to get this information. I'm not sure I responded to all you wanted to know, Jonathan.
I don't know if you
Good.
answered Andrew's question, but I just wanted to add a little note about equipment. So I don't know if you know,
Of course, you're more middle-aged than me, so please.
there was this book by Noel Fellows a few years ago, Jousting Medieval Renaissance Iberia. So it's mostly about jousting, not about equipment for crusades, for traveling. But he does mention the difference between this heavy ceremonial equipment and the ones which was used on kind of actual travels. He shows that some of those sets of armor, which was for jousting, it had replaceable pieces. But it's again focuses on those more expensive things. But he has some very good material on the genetic writing as well, if you're interested.
And I will just add something. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you. Yeah, because I repaired, I saw the saddle Brenda was showing about the Spanish saddle, for example, and we still have the same models of traveling equipment that we were using already in the 16th and the 17th. Some of them had a little fashion pimping, we can say, but lots of them are still used nowadays because they were really practical. And the saddle Brenda saw, for example, I'm really happy to have one. It's really comfy because with this fluffy, you know, furniture, and it was made because a lot of people don't realize also the problem we had here in Portugal and Spain with the heat, and the heat was really the enemy. And so a lot of the protection and equipment that were made for traveling were also made to avoid the heat and all the pain it can cause to the saddles, for example, to the bottoms, to the, you know, the rest of the body. And so we have a lot of long sleeves, really long hats, really big one, really flat, usually to have a big shadow with it, and in the saddle something really comfortable, but not too much painful for the heat. So like you know, skins of other animals, for example, like lambs and things like that.
One of the things that I wanted to add to what Diane said was that when you look at, and I put some links into the chat, when you pull up crusade images, these were not the knights in heavy plate armor. They had lighter armor in those days. The horses, you can tell by these images over and over again, you see the rider's feet hanging well below the belly of the horses. And,
well, they were small ponies, I believe, at that time, well, is what they had.
Really ponies. They're not ponies. I mean, if you talk about a horse that is 14 hands, you know, the FEI calls that horse a pony today, but a 14.2 hand horse, and you put a man of the Middle Ages who was 5'6" or 5'7", or, you know, translate that into the metrics, who was a much smaller person as well. You see the parallel if you go to if you take a look at the Spanish riding school, you look at the Lipizzaner's, those are not big horses. Those are, they're very compact, they're very powerful. And the people selected as riders there cannot be, you know, too tall or too heavy, because they're out of proportion. And so when you're going back, you know, almost, you know, 900, 1,000 years, people were smaller, horses were smaller, and they also, especially when gunpowder and longbows and those sort of things were still kind of in development, they, gunpowder ended the era of the night. So, it was a whole different world. And so when you get into these huge plate armored 500,000 pound things, that's like Henry VIII gained weight and he wanted to look good on a horse. So he needed a great big horse and he dolled it up with everything he had. So a lot of that armor was actually ceremonial and
Sure.
that sort of thing. So that's kind of my take on it.
Mhm. Gotcha.
There is lots of research on medieval horses. They could have been even smaller than 14 hands. And by the way, in Russia, 14 hands is already a horse. They have a smaller standard for ponies, a lower standard. Probably because they have lots of indigenous pony breeds. And just a fun fact, there is a traveler from England who has been traveling through Siberia recently, this winter actually, on 2 Yakutian horses who are like 12 and 13 hands. And he's like a normal sized man and he had to carry his equipment, his tent on one horse and some food for the horses and for himself. And he traveled from Magadan to somewhere. I don't remember, but in the new volume of Chiron, there will be a short news item about this. You will have all the details. So it still can be done. You can look up on the web about Nikita Grets and his travels as well. So if people want to kind of
there were a question from Catherine. Maybe I can also answer.
Yeah.
She was put afterwards, and we can just go down the chat maybe. So Catherine, you were talking about the Fergana Valley myths. So there is two. I was saying, so the myths that were not really known outside of Portugal was the Portuguese myth of Iberic horses that will supposedly have been created by the wind blowing into the nose of Iberic mares. So this was a myth that was only known on the Iberic Peninsula and some of authors, writers around the Mediterranean Sea. The Fergana Valley myths is a myth that is a little older and that is already known, I think, in Europe. But you can find some informations about it. I think it's the Emperor Han in the 2nd century before Christ that has made a war to the tribes because of his will to capture these horses that were considered as a really great power of conquer. And so in the legend, there were supposedly the creation of dragons and unicorns because people were into unicorns until the 19th century. So they were thinking 17, 18, they were starting to believe maybe it was not a real animal, but until then they were actually convinced unicorns were existing. And so Fergana Valley horses were supposedly sons of unicorns and dragons, have a lot of different properties, to be fast as the wind, to have to sweat blood instead of regular sweat. They had all these fascinating characteristics on it. And so you have some sources about Alexander the Great travels that are also talking about them. Because in Alexander's travels, you have some notion of him. So he has different encounters with myths. One is supposedly to have meet the Queen of the Amazons, and he was supposedly during his travel on the east side going to capture some of the 500 Fergana Valley horses. He was supposedly buying them to increase his own horses and to make a better breeding. So this is what I know of it. I tried to remember it, but I didn't find it. It was always allusion in different other historical books or other myths books. I don't think there has been a book dedicated to this myth, but I'm sure all this region must have way more than this. It's the only one the more famous one.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Then I had Andrew.
Yeah, so lots of comments about
I'm
the
sorry,
sizes
yeah, I
of
didn't,
horses
I didn't
and
mean
the
to.
weight of equipment, the weight of knights. I think it's a huge topic, which is kind
Yes.
of beyond. There has been so many studies, and just believe me that the war horses were not heavy or big. And finally,
Yeah, just
yeah,
yeah, you're right. Now I think Andrew was more about Arabic, the Arabic sources, the fact that
okay,
a lot of Moors.
it would be
Yeah.
good to answer this one.
Okay. Because no, I agree with you, and the problem is that in history we always it's history is the one that the winners have been writing a lot of times, and it's true that about all the equipment we always have more equipment of celebrations than on everyday lives, and it's always the hardest sometimes to find. But about the Moorish sources, yes, we had a big politic of burned land in Portugal during the Reconquest. That means erasing all traces that were during the Moorish domination, that went from covering ancient mosques with new churches that were still having a little shape of a mosque, but with a cross on it, we won't see it anymore, to burning papers, to erasing some of the tracks. One of the source you can have about the way they were mounting are some of the treatises of horse riding, for example, the one from Don Duarte, where it has a lot of references about how the Moors were handling the horses, because it was not so long ago. I mean, Don Duarte wrote only 1 century after the end of the departure of all the Moors from the Iberic Peninsula, because the conquest finished more or less around 1350, and the book by Don Duarte was only 1 century afterwards, which seems really big, but at the same time there were a lot of influences from the Moorish equipment and way of mounting that were still here. But for now I haven't found so much written Arabic text there, maybe on the Spanish side of the border, because the Spanish were really more efficient than we were in Portugal to store and to keep the written parts. So in the Andalusian part, I think we can find way more text than this, and in ancient Spanish or in Arabic.
I think that one of the issues that people, were kind of discussing in the chat is how quickly you can change the look of a horse, of a breed, or of a land race within just a few generations. If you're breeding consistently for size, or you're breeding consistently for color, or you're breeding consistently for some other trait, you can take a horse breed from 15 hands average to 17 hands average in 50 years.
Yes, well, that's what happened with the Latvian warblood. Exactly. Well, we have now 2 types, and they're very different, because the heavy type, it's a bit smaller than the light type. And in the light type, you can have horses which are 17 hands and up, and they're breeding them very high. In the heavy types, it's called heavy, but they're quite smallish. Some of them are big, but they're on the whole much smaller. I would just like to thank people who shared files. Timothy shared the photo, and Brenda an article, I think, or an image, or a Mexican vaquero. So thank you. We don't really have much time left, but if people really want, we can have a seminar later on about the horse sizes. If people want to talk about horse sizes and selective breeding. I'm just aware of the time passing, and I don't know if it's late where you are.
Can I respond to Jonathan?
Yes.
I mean, he asked, bringing horses to the Levant for the Crusades. I mean, you have to think these horses came from Spain, from southern France, from southern Italy, from Sicily. So they were quite used to this climate. The climate is not that different. You know, to me, the more interesting question is, you know, the Arabs had good horses. Why did the Crusaders continue to import horses to the Levant? So there must have been something special about the horses the Europeans brought. And you can also see it from later bulls, where the popes forbade the Spanish from supplying horses to the Moors. To secure that this was considered superior military technology, and Europe, I mean the Christian Europe, tried to prevent these horses from falling into enemy hands. And also you see the fights between the Saracens and the Crusaders. The Saracens always tried to kill the horses. They didn't want the horses for themselves, but they knew that because there must have been something in the tactics that made Saracen horses good for Saracens, but the Western horses good for the Crusaders, and it didn't mix. I don't know what, but that those are just the facts.
Very interesting. Thank you.
The other thing is, of course, we didn't really have breeds as we think of them today until about the 1700s. You had pedigrees written down. For example, again, the Iberian Peninsula, you started to have monastics writing down pedigrees in the 1300s and in the 1400s. But they were doing is they were keeping breeding records for individual horse breeders to keep everybody honest. And so when you talk about a horse from, you know, Andalusia or someplace like that, they weren't talking about a pure breed since the, you know, caves, you know, cave paintings. They were talking about a horse that was developed in this particular area. And so if you had a skill set and a training set and an animal adapted to how you grew up and how you fought, of course, you are going to take that animal with you and try to make more of them wherever you go because it's what you already know. But if you take a place that's kind of a closed system and there's not a lot of outside stuff coming in, you'll see over the course of time kind of a reversion to whatever adapts to the climate, to the geography, and so on. So it's really important to remember that the concept of breed purity very closely, and we know this in American history only too well, the concept of breed purity very closely parallels the development of race-based slavery of human beings. You know, the idea that there's just you know, the fact that the word breed in English is usually translated as race in a lot of other languages. That's something we're very careful about in America. We will not refer to an animal breed as a race because racial politics are very, very sensitive here, as I think everyone knows. And so whenever we're looking at horses from any time prior to about 1700, maybe 1650 at the earliest, you're looking at, you know, the horses from such and such region where the people were skilled and the training was great and the culture was very, very horsey. So I think when we get into all of that, it's very important to know how horses were tied to the land, and that's key to a lot of this stuff.
And I think what you're also showing here is also the part of a symbolic, which is obviously for me, we are literal as such. It's a little more my thing, but even if I need history too. But for example, this element of killing the horse, you have to imagine all the symbolic behind the rituals of killing the horse, and in all Indo-Europeans myths, and still now in the Middle East and the Eastern Europe, you still have a lot of rites and rituals linked to the killing of a horse and to the death of a horse, that you're burying with the honor, or that you're killing to take the advantage from the other to your enemy. You know, it's a way of appropriating yourself to take also the force of your enemy and to take its power, you know. And there is also the other, for example, we had other type of rights. Sometimes we were killing them, sometimes we were cutting the hair. We have some archaeological founding about some different process we were doing, not only killing them, but sometimes we were cutting the hoofs, sometimes we're cutting the hair of the horses. So they had a lot of symbolic also around these horses and these battles. And also the way of breeding them, and the way it was really linked to the use they had. And all the Spanish and Portuguese, for example, horses has always been really linked really much to the cattle handling. And so we had also during a long time, for example, in Portugal, we are still selectioning and breeding the horses by the bullfighting qualities. If you have a stallion, for example, you want to mate, or you want to sell to mate with other mares, you will put him in some, you know, a lot of Lusitano horses are good reproductor, because for them they have a courage and they have the force and the strength and everything. And so they have been developing some really shoulderly horses because of the contact with the bulls and the contact with the cattle. And I think it could have been also an advantage in some fights already, because we have some linked activity with the bulls already from the Roman period and then the Middle Age period in Peninsula Iberic, you know, the Iberic Peninsula. And so this must have had an influence on the breeding of the horses, and then on the aptitude to combat, because of what they were already trained to do at home. And so you can't, you know, also take out of this part.
Thank you for this. And what Jörg has been saying about climates is very important. That's one of the factors which made me doubt that the Knights brought Spanish horses in, because well, Spanish horses, Spain and the Iberic Peninsula has a very different climate from Latvia. Latvia is like the UK. It's quite wet, humid, with very large pastures. Well, harsher winters is the only difference. And recently, those Spanish Lusitano horses have become quite popular in Latvia. I've seen 2 of them last year living in Latvia, and they don't do well in Latvia. They grow very fat and they have hooves problems because we have very soft soil. They don't raise the way they would when they were walking on this mountain rocks. They have too hard hooves, so they have to be trimmed very regularly. So people are just, you know, not very finding it very hard to keep them to the best of their health. And these people, I guess, would have been much better off with the typical Latvian warmbloods of the heavy type, who are perfectly adapted to the land and who don't have any health problems, even if they grow very fat. Well, with those Spanish horses, if they grow fat, they have laminitis. And it means they have to be kept alone, away from other horses who don't have laminitis, who enjoy large grass. And they, of course, they're not happy about it. They try to run away. They have to have something on their muzzles. So I wonder how Jörg manages to keep his Baroque Spanish horse. How the family have Baroque Spanish horses who are just driving in Ireland, which also has wonderful lush vegetation, but they manage it. In Latvia, they don't really do it the same wonderful way. Maybe don't know experience. Maybe one day we could have a session on horse breeding and bringing different breeds into conditions in which they don't thrive. That's something I just realized as a horse owner, because I have a thoroughbred from the UK who just drives here despite heavy winter. She lives out. She's been with me for 11 years. She's quite okay. but Spanish horses don't seem to drive here. That's just my small experience. And also there was a comment from Cynthia that she reminded us that we are going to have a talk organized by Equine History Collective in April. And we are going to talk about medieval Hippocratic treatises, and she promised she will talk about breeding there. So make sure you don't miss it. It will be on Facebook, and I will share it in our Facebook group and send emails to people who are subscribing to the Cairo newsletter. So another wonderful opportunity. I'm aware of the fact that time is kind of passing. It might be late, but people might have to go somewhere. Unless people have kind of final quick questions, remarks. Are we okay with wrapping this up?
Thank you, everyone. It's been great fun to talk with you all.
Yeah, I don't want to kick people out, but I'm sure that people would want to stay all night talking about horses. Diana and Brenda, and you've got so much information. And I hope we meet another time and talk about horses some more. So our next event in a month's time, in March, it will be a round table about horse and rider relationship. So we have to move it, change the schedule. The original was scheduled for April, but we're moving it to March. So the round table will be a little bit different. We'll have more speakers, 5 speakers. They will be talking for like very short time. But after this, we will hopefully have a lovely discussion about the history of horse-rider relationship and how it might be in future. So thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
That was
Yay.
really nice.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye. Have a nice day.